All so much for coming, and this is precisely why I keep saying we need a bigger building. We are very fortunate tonight, and I think that's clearly why we are so packed. I hope everybody's got a seat. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Anna Heller. I'm the Bruce A. Beal Director of the museum, and I am delighted to welcome you to our first lecture for our Matisse's Printmaker exhibition. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to acknowledge the organizers of the exhibition, the American Federation for the Arts and the Pierre and Tana Matisse Foundation. As you may know, it's a traveling exhibition. Was a traveling exhibition, had a number of venues, 4 venues through 2011, and because the initial tour was so successful, they decided to add 3 more venues, and we got lucky to be the first of the 3. It's an extraordinary exhibition that shows the range and the creativity of Matisse's printed work, and today we're very fortunate to have not only the curator of the exhibition, Jay Fisher, with us, but he's also the curator of the single largest collection of Matisse prints in this country, which belongs to the Baltimore Museum of Art. Here at the Cornell, I do want to acknowledge our sponsors for the exhibition, the Bessemer Trust, Bruce and D. Douglas, Mark and Laura Cosgrove, and the Director Circle of the Cornell Fine Arts Museum, and of course our parent Rollins College, but also I want to acknowledge the sponsors of tonight's lecture, the Thomas P. Johnson Scholarship Fund here at the Cornell. Jay Fisher, as I said, is the Senior Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, and the Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs at the Baltimore Museum of Art, which means he's effectively in charge of all the curatorial departments there. He has lectured nationally and internationally in his area of expertise and has degrees from Occidental College and Williams College. His particular area of expertise is the 19th century and modern French prints and drawings. And in his area, he's organized a lot of different exhibitions, wrote the Catalogue Raisonné on the prints of Théodore Chassériau, and directed a project to catalog and create an online database of the Baltimore Museum of Art's 19th century French drawings in concert with the Walters Art Museum, also in Baltimore, which resulted in the publication and exhibition, The Essence of Line, French Drawing from Ingres to Degas. More recently, he has focused on, as I said, the largest collection of Matisse prints and drawings at the BMA, and a result of that research was the exhibition that you see next door, as well as another exhibition, the Matisse Painter as Sculptor, which traveled to Dallas and San Francisco, and currently preparing a major publication on Matisse's first illustrated book, the Les Poésies de Stéphane Mallarmé. So tonight, Jay Fisher will share with us his expertise on Matisse print as a printmaker within his oeuvre as a painter and a sculptor. So please welcome Jay Fisher.
Thank you very much, Hannah. The microphone working okay? Good, very good. I want to thank Anna for supporting this lecture and bringing me here, and also to Amy, the curator, who did a wonderful job hanging the exhibition, and also to Sandy, who made the arrangements for this talk. This is my first visit to Winter Park, to Orlando, and to this museum. And if you know something about the weather that's going on up north, the timing was particularly fortuitous. As I was getting on the plane from Baltimore about 15 minutes before the storm started up there, and it's going on right now. It's quite, I've gotten pictures from my colleagues. It's quite beautiful, but also things have come to a grinding halt. So it's wonderful to be down here in this nice weather. Unfortunately, I have to go back tomorrow, so we'll see. I may spend some time in your lovely airport. It's wonderful to see the show again. I haven't seen it for a while. It had a point of rest in between a couple of tours. And it's wonderful to see it because it's been beautifully hung here in the museum. And I think really is a wonderful show for opening up our sensibility and appreciation for Matisse as a printmaker. I want to get across a few general ideas, and we'll sort of run through those ideas chronologically. The exhibition is basically hung chronologically, and it's a good way of looking at the different kinds of ideas and approaches that Matisse took towards printmaking. But like most artists, you can't really pry them into a chronology that totally makes sense. Matisse, for instance, was an artist who revisited his ideas over and over again. He would come up with an idea, and then 20 years later, he would go back to it and explore it in a different way. You may be challenged by the light levels in the exhibition, but that's very important for preserving all works on paper. And you'll find that the longer that you spend in the galleries, the more you'll get used to it. You'll adjust, just as you do to the darkness in here and the screen. And the thing that makes adjusting to the light and seeing prints by Matisse so impressively is the primacy of drawing. For printmaking, for Matisse, it was all about drawing. Printmaking was a way to extend his drawing. I think of Matisse as a very generous artist because he very much wanted to share the process, his way of thinking visually, his way of transforming what he saw in the studio through his drawing into something that was uniquely his. Because printmaking is a democratic art, allows far more of us to be able to see his work than those lucky few that would be able to see a painting or a sculpture in their own personal collections. Matisse realized that and saw printmaking as a way that he could extend his ideas and really his process, his way of seeing for more people. Let's start with this self-portrait by Matisse. It's shown in two states. So this is an early state that you see in the exhibition, and this is a later state from our collection. Basically, unlike Rembrandt down there, Matisse was not an artist that worked through a complicated set of what we call states or stages of prints. He basically did it right off, and that was it. He didn't go back to the plate or back to the stone and start making a lot of changes. But for his first print, he did, and of course his model, not surprisingly, was Rembrandt. I'd say it's a pretty ambitious beginning to begin your printmaking career with a self-portrait based on Rembrandt. Yet he studied the model well in terms of beginning to learn how etching worked, and this is an etching. As he's looking in a mirror, he's also looking straight at us. It's interesting to see what happens to this print as it goes from the early state to the second one. It's as if he began to sort of take out the hands to try to suppress them a little bit. Some people have felt that what he was really doing was something rather romantic, to create a kind of aura around his hands, acknowledging them as the way that his genius could be manifested. But I think it was really more a case that the rather awkward hand he's never interested in hand. They're always kind of awkward. You just kind of stop looking at them after a while. These rather awkward hands were somewhat distracting. Look at how much stronger the concentration is on his eyes now looking out at us or looking at himself in the mirror. The projection of his confidence as an artist, and really the hard work that is part of the way that he approached what he was doing. These early prints are very much like sketches from a sketchbook, and if you'll notice up there are two other self-portrait sketches that Matisse made, probably when he was starting out on the plate, and he just turned it around to do the final C that we know so well. I expect that while these eventually were printed in a small edition, these were really made for himself, made really for his family, something very personal to him, but a very strong statement of how important printmaking was. This is another print from these early years, again a dry point from 1900, 1903. The self-portrait was both a dry point and etching. This is exclusively a dry point. And again, it seems like a rather odd print to have made if you were trying to sell it or to print it in a large edition. In fact, these early prints were not really done in large editions. I'm not sure so much that he was thinking about collectors as he was thinking about himself. Again, the reason that it looks like a sketchbook page is that the figure of the model's in two different orientations, one standing up, and then he turned the plate around and did it on the side. This is a wonderful portrait of his daughter, Margaret, born in 1894, and his son, Jean, born in 1900. So again, a sign of the personal, of working in the studio. Not such an ambitious indication of his future skill and importance as a printmaker, but rather an indication of the artist at the beginning. There are certain paintings, and I pulled out a few to look at as we go through. I don't want to spoil you by too much color as you're in the midst of going in and looking at a show that's with a couple of exceptions, all black and white. But it's hard to avoid this wonderful painting, which is, of course, in the Barnes Foundation, now in Philadelphia. That's the old Barnes there in Marion. Let's see. Let me go back to it. There are certain paintings which seem to sum up where Matisse was at this point in 1905 and 6, and very much show the way that he would move in the future. This is particularly a picture and an era that he would revisit in the 1930s. But in this painting, we don't exactly see a realistic scene. It's very much idealized, as if you were in an idyllic classical world. But what I want to point out is how he drew these figures. And look at them, they almost looked as if they're collaged on these flat fields of color. Look at how he's outlined them to bring forth the contour of the figures. And really there isn't any shading to speak of. It's a linear conception. And there's a kind of orchestration of all this linearity of these figures, not only moving within the figures and the wonderful, this is the first time this dance appears. It'll again become the subject of the great paintings at MoMA and in Russia. Even the linearity of the trees, the extensions of the figures, all of it is a kind of orchestrated, not only color, but sort of a linear delight, an idyllic linear world. At the same time, he did these two remarkable woodcuts. And to think that between 1903, when he did those dry point etchings that we began with, to get to these amazing woodcuts is really extraordinary. He made 4 woodcuts in all, and that was it, never made another one. They're very close to drawing. In fact, we understand that what Matisse did was to draw on a wooden block, and then his wife, Amélie, actually cut the block from which the prints were made. At one time, they were thought to be linoleum cuts, and I think that's because of the linearity, which is a little bit counterintuitive to woodblock. If you've ever made one, you have to carve into the wood. It's nothing that you can really do a free curvilinear approach. But somehow, in the woodcutting, the translation of his drawing came across quite beautifully. These works are in a way somewhat conceptual because they require you to begin to catch on to what Matisse is doing as a draftsman. First of all, again, we don't see any shading. What we do is we see these figures, like in the Joie de Vivre, these figures which are drawn in a linear fashion, concentration on the outline. So you get that kind of linear rhythm, but no shading to really give us any indication of modeling volume. The same with this one over here. Again, the emphasis of the linearity of the figures, absolutely no shading. But yet they're full of light. And where does the light come from? The light comes from the white of the paper. You could almost imagine, these prints are sometimes called Fauvist prints because they were done at the same time that Matisse was doing his radically colorful paintings, such as the Bonheur de Vivre. Yet there isn't any color here. How can we talk about these as colorful? Well, it's through the stark contrast of the drawing such as here, the drawing that really represents shading, or these strong lines here, the stark contrast between that dark and this brilliant white creates a kind of radiation, a kind of vibrating tone. When we, when we look at this area here, it looks rather odd. But we know that it's about shading. It's about the shadow that's behind this figure. Here are these little dots. We know what that is too. It's just, next slide is wonderful. There's an artist that Matisse was looking at and that was very influential, particularly for these early woodcuts. This is very interestingly, it belongs to the Philadelphia Museum right now, but it did belong to Matisse himself. So this is a Van Gogh drawing that he actually owned from 1888. He studied Van Gogh very carefully, and I think that those of you that initially just picked it up, again, when we look at things like this, we know what these marks indicate because we can read the space, we can read this as a haystack, we can see these as tiles on a roof. But yet there's something very individualistic and in a way sort of self-conscious about them because these are Van Gogh's marks. He's developing a language which is based on reality but transformed in a way that's really his. And when you look at these, you see the same thing. So this way, background or the decoration on a wall behind the figure, it works in terms of face and in giving us the sense of depth within the scene, especially against the linearity of the figures in the same way that Van Gogh does. Another thing that's extraordinarily important about Matisse, and you can see it well in this exhibition of printmaking, is what I would call his tendency to work in different modes, to see in different ways. So you would ask yourself, you know, how can Matisse in the same year see, excuse me, I'm going the wrong way, see this way and see this way? The composition is about the same. Again, we're seeing a reclining nude with hands above the head, a very typical subject for Matisse at this time, perhaps influenced by Michelangelo and his great figures from the Medici tomb. But look at here how much differently it's done. First of all, it's done directly on the stone, so he's drawn directly on the stone. And he's drawn almost as if he was a cubist. And this is, of course, much before Cubism. There's a kind of slashing line to it. He also goes back into the stone and rubs the medium a bit on the stone to get a slight suggestion of modeling. So here, he hasn't just stuck to the linearity of the figure done by outline. Here, he's using modeling in the classic sense of chiaroscuro, of light and shade. He hasn't given us anything to suggest the features of the face at all. It's almost like they were a model. This is such an abstract idea that many art historians have actually argued that it has to be from later, that it has to be from 1913 and instead of 1906, because it just, you wonder how can he think in this different way at exactly the same time. But we now know through documentation about some early exhibitions that this print was shown in 1906, so that pretty much solves that issue. Now, the other great painting that's very much in Matisse's mind is our beautiful Blue Nude, probably the most famous work of art in our museum, and a remarkable work of art it is. The Blue Nude was a radical work that he was doing at this time in 1906 and 1907, which was greeted by the critics with great disdain and criticism that he just didn't know how to draw, didn't know how to paint, didn't have a realistic sense of color. But I think you can see in this painting, again, some of the same characteristics that we've seen already in the prints. Again, the reliance on drawing outline to create these silhouetted shapes, as sculptural as she is in terms of three-dimensional form, and at the same time he made a sculpture of exactly the same pose. So that creates a sort of radical three-dimensional feeling, but you still see the silhouetted figure which almost seems pasted like a collage on the scene in the background. But what an orchestration of linearity between the background, the hips, and everything about the figure begins to flow together. Another thing that's very important to see in this painting, and that you also see in the prints, is that Matisse was a very generous artist in wanting to take us along with his process. So you see lots of indications of him changing his mind, of reworking, such as this here, where you see the breast. It looks like it might have been over there, or perhaps a shadow was added. You can see how he moves the position of the shoulder. And we often see these same kinds of changes in the prints, because it gave him a way to show a process of transformation, a process of seeing, so that he's literally inviting you into the studio so that you can sort of look over his shoulder and see what he's doing. This is another one of Matisse's lithographs from 1906. Again, a very active year for printmaking. He did a series of about 10 of these lithographs, all made from the same model. So a series of prints, and this is one of the first instances where we can underline another important factor about Matisse as a printmaker, namely his tendency to want to work in series, a kind of theme and variation. And one of the frustrating things about most exhibitions is that you're sort of encouraged to pick out as many different single images as you can. And artists that tend to work in series often don't get that idea across in an exhibition. But fortunately, because of the depth of the Pierre and Tana Matisse Foundation that is the basis of this show, we're able to bring out a number of prints that are from the same series, so you can see how he's thinking about things. This is a very good example of how very closely a lithograph, in this case these are transfer lithographs, where Matisse drew in a very rough and aggressive way with a crayon, a soft crayon that's kind of broke up from the texture of the paper. But look at how close the feeling of this is as you look at it next to a sculpture. Again, you see the concentration on outline, the linearity of the silhouette, but you also get that same sense when you look at a sculpture as you see it, as you initially see the lines. It's only when you look at a sculpture in light that you begin to see how an artist models the surface of the sculpture very much like he would draw a shading. But in this case, Matisse is able to suggest the volume of the figure just by concentrating on outline without any use of shading. In order to be able to understand that so well, Matisse made sculptures of many of these same poses. This is another print, 6, which is amazing in terms of the way in which Matisse, again, uses just a few lines. If you know Matisse, you think about this as characteristic for his later work, as you think ahead to the Matisse, the paper cutouts or the individual drawings that he made towards the end of his career. But it's amazing how close he is to developing that language even as early as 1906. So this is a print from 1906, and then this is one from 1913, the second series of lithographs that he made. You can see how Matisse has made an amazing amount of change, and he didn't actually make any prints between 1906 and 1913. So he had some time to reflect before he went back to printmaking. So again, look at this back, which seems as if the lines are almost a little out of control. It's not, in a way, as distilled as the lines are here. There are fewer of them. It's more a synthesis where the whole figure suggests the volume of 3 dimensions. And look at how few lines there are and how important it is the way that Matisse places the figure on the piece of paper. This is something, this show is about looking, and so you really need to take some time to look. Not only look at Matisse's line, but look at how he put the figure within the dimensions of the paper, leaning to one side or the other, that he could sort of fill that entire space, which at the same time brings it alive. This is another one of the prints from 1913 that's in the exhibition. Again, a series of 10 or 11 prints in all in their actually, we have 3 or 4 in exhibition. Now, in 1914, he moves to another technique, another exploration in printmaking, which took him in a new direction. And that interest was in doing an etching and dry pointing. If you think back to those rather modest dry points that we saw at the beginning of the talk, and now think about what etching allowed him, you'll see why he responded to it so strongly. This is a portrait of his daughter, Marguerite, who we saw in that little dry point at the beginning. And Marguerite worked very hard to help him with printmaking, learning it herself. She was kind of a studio kid, and she stayed around in the studio and really devoted her life to supporting her father, and in this case she learned enough about printmaking to help Matisse. Matisse was not a technician. He was not trained as a printmaker. He understood printmaking and understood the possibilities, but relied on experts, on printers, and other artists that were more familiar with printmaking to help suggest the possibilities that he might discover in his own work. Etching had a much greater sense of flow, and it also gave him a way to begin this very interesting style, which is to crop these images of friends of his. This is the critic and Walter Pock. He did a whole series of these etchings in 1914 where he would force them into these tight rectangles and squares that prevented the possibility of drawing the fullness of the face to suggest really the volume, and kind of reduced it to his very keen observation of just a few of the facial features. There's an interesting story about Walter Pock and this etching. He went to see Matisse, and Matisse suggested that he would make an etching of them, of Walter Pock. Walter Pock looked at his watch and thought, oh my God, out of here in about 10 minutes, and I know Matisse does too, so I don't really want him to do this now. If he's going to do an etching of me, I'd rather he did it when he had more time. So he told that to Matisse, and Matisse said, no, let me do it. And this emphasizes how fast Matisse would work. So very quickly he did this etching. But Pock was still said as he went out the door, I look forward to seeing you again. I really want to come back, and perhaps we can do another print that will give you more time. So when he came back, Matisse very carefully pulled out both of the prints, and they both agreed that the one that he made more rapidly was much better than the one that he took more time, and that one was actually destroyed. At the same time in 1914, he also began to undertake a wonderful category of his printmaking where he did a technique called monotype. And what a monotype is you take a copper plate and you cover it with ink, and then you take a little piece of cardboard or something wound up tight, and you just draw by taking away the ink. So it's the opposite. Instead of the lines being dark against a white field, it's white lines against a dark field. The wonderful thing about monotype is that it was very easy to do, didn't require really any technology at all. And if he didn't like the result, he just wiped the ink off and did another one and threw the print away. Or, well, actually, he didn't even have to make a print. He could see it right there. What he did with both these early etchings, like Walter Pock, and also these monotypes, is that he made images of his friends. And Marquet was one of his fellow Fauve paintings, and he prided himself on being able to understand their features, and he creates these challenges, again, by creating such a tight area to actually do the image, by making the image so big within these are tiny prints, as you'll see when you're in the exhibition, but he expands the image to the entire extent of the copper plate and then the piece of paper. Another one, which is of a crop nude. Again, it would have been difficult enough to try to fit the whole nude within this strange rectangular space. But he drew this in a way that the edges cut off, so you feel this figure almost exploding, trying to get out of that constrained dimension that Matisse placed the figure in, but you're not really missing anything either. You get the sense of the entire figure, and even though it's drawn just in terms of outline, the way that his line develops those wonderful curves, he's able to bring out all the characteristics to really suggest more volume than is actually intuitively there. In all these early works, we begin to see how Matisse is bringing us along so that we really come to understand his visual language. It's drawn just in terms of outline. The way that his line develops those wonderful curves, he's able to bring out all the characteristics to really suggest more. One single model, studying her in the studio so that she moves around. And Matisse would say that he learned a lot from his models because he watched how they moved. He watched how they took upon their gestures. And he would learn from them and develop a sense of drawing them in linearity that was particular to them. He doesn't really give us very much information about faces ever. Another thing that he would say about his models is that for him they were objects. That sounds, rather unkind, but that's really what he meant. He wasn't interested in us getting lost in personalities or thinking about them as individuals. He wanted us to concentrate on how he was taking that figure and transforming it in his own particular way. Thinking back to the early prints we looked at from 1906, where we saw prints that were both linear and then tonal, as in the nude that looked like the blue nude, we find that same thing between these prints. So between the linearity of this in 1925 or this arabesque from 1924, we see how Matisse, in this case, brings back a little bit of that shading. It's interesting to see. It's really got three things going on. So first we see the linearity of the way that the figure is drawn, essentially in outline. Then we see all this decorative detail in the background, and this is very typical of his paintings of this time. The way that we read all this decorative detail and ornamentation is to see it as flat. In a way, one of the things that makes this print so flat is the fact that all the lines have about the same degree of tonality as you move across the surface. So you're not getting much indication of forward and back. Your eye gets lost in all of this. The ornamentation in the background seems to be in sync with how he's drawn the figure and the outline. And also, of course, the decoration on her blouse is the same as the decoration in the background. So your eye tends to join this all together. But still, he's able to suggest some space in the scene and able to situate the figure as something three-dimensional. It's interesting what he did with shading. In this case, these are lithographs which were transferred. He drew on a piece of paper, and then the image was transferred off the paper and onto the stone. You can see how he took one side of the crayon and just kind of dragged it across the ornamentation. So he doesn't try to draw the shaded areas within a shape, but just kind of lays the shading down in such a way. There's some areas up here that have no shading, and they kind of jump out against the shading that tends to hold the ornamentation here slightly back. So again, you have a greater sense of space. Also in 1923, he made a change. He'd done all the lithographs, really, with the exception of that one 1906 with the raised arm. All the early lithographs are this transfer method, so drawing on paper and transferring it to the stone. But starting in 1922 and 23, Matisse began to challenge himself by working directly on the stone with a crayon and really devoting himself to really understanding how shading would work and how he would work with shading relative to still trying to create a simplicity in, say, the drawing of the features. This is one of his most famous prints from this time, again, a little later in 29, called The White Fox. That has to do with the fur that he's wearing. This is the the side of a chair that he, sort of bamboo chair or something like that, that kind of sticks out. It sort of picks up the same kind of feeling of the necklace there. Look at how amazingly he's been able to control the tonality in these sections that almost look like curtains of tone, very gradually modulated in back of her. Again, you know, you're tempted to want to know who this is, but like all of Matisse's models, they all look totally bored or preoccupied. They sort of look like they're looking at us, but not really. And Matisse really didn't want us to identify with them. They're just models. That's all they are in his Matissean world. Another work that he was working, that was going on actually all the way from 1922 to 1929 was this great sculpture of the large-seated nude. I talked at the beginning about the way that he would revisit ideas. Well, in the 20s, mostly inspired by a set of plaster casts of the Medici tombs by Michelangelo, so a plaster cast that was in Nice, he started going back to this same reclining nude pose like the blue nude with with arms held above his head. And he worked on this sculpture for a long time, for almost 7 years. At the same time, he made charcoal drawings, such as this one, which is in our collection, a charcoal drawing, and also these wonderful lithographs, two of which are in the exhibition, including this one, where this is actually a transfer lithograph. So Matisse had moved from drawing directly on the stone to explore shading to going back to drawing on paper. One of the things that he loved about transfer lithography, first of all, was the fact that he didn't have to bother with a very heavy stone. He could just draw on a piece of paper and turn it over to the printer to get it on the stone. The other thing that he liked about transfer lithography is he loved to be able to get the texture of the paper. So wherever he drew on that paper, you can see a little bit here, the laid lines of the paper. You can see here's actually a watermark that was on the paper. So the texture of the paper would break up the tone that he was drawing on the piece of paper. And he loved about the fact that he could transfer all that sense of subtlety of shading to the lithography stone to actually make a multiple, a print that could be shared. So at the same time he was thinking of that reclining nude sculpture, and I told you how important it is to think of sculpture as a surface, not just a silhouetted shape, but also a surface which is modeled in the same way as these charcoal and lithographic prints. This is the other great one, the large odalisque with striped pants, which again is a riot of pattern and challenges for our eye. You see that he's got the pattern of the striped pants against this more decorative pattern of the material that covers the chair up here as well. All of this is competing in a way, a kind of could be a distraction, but for Matisse is all beautifully orchestrated so that we not only experience the flatness of these patterns, but the modeling as if she was a sculpture of the figure herself. There are a few prints that correlate directly with paintings, such as what we see here. This is a painting from our collection of the standing odalisque reflected in a mirror, and a lithograph that would have been made at exactly the same time. I think the lithograph probably came after the painting, but it might have come before. It's interesting to look at, though, how in two different mediums, Matisse couldn't rely, obviously, in this one, on the use of color to suggest these planes of color that go back into the background. Here he just had black and white, so he had to use shading in a way to represent the areas, the sense of progression in what was a very restricted linear space. Another painting from our collection, not quite so wild in color as it's coming off in this slide, but it's pretty close. A painting from 1926 of his many paintings of odalisques in interior, that you'll see some of the same characteristics in the prints. This is a pen and ink drawing in our collection from 1928 called the Odalisque with the checkerboard, which correlates very well to an etching that was made in 1929. 1929 was a period of enormous productivity for Matisse in terms of printmaking. He literally made hundreds of prints, both etchings and lithographs. You can see how the etching line very well suited the same sensibility that he would use in a pen and ink drawing, where he again is able to just achieve the essence of the ornamentation, the figure modeled with a sense of three-dimensional form, and then all these overlapping patterns from the checkerboard to this tray tipped up, to decoration on the floor, and the decoration in the background. It would seem as if they're all on the same plane, but we come to read them as being a space because of what we've learned about Matisse's graphic language. This is one of my favorite series, which you'll see actually has about 6 prints in it, and they all show a woman looking at a fish bowl. And it's again so wonderful. First of all, looking at the model, aren't they all sort of dreamy? And some of them are paying attention to the fish, but it looks like they're just kind of staring out blankly. These are small prints, maybe 1, 2, 3 inches in width, and maybe 4 inches in height. So very small. The figures are very up close. I mean, there's not much space there. And just this wonderful sense of his powers of observation as he watches the same model looking at the fish, how he's able to suggest that these fish are swimming in a bowl, yet everything about it is flat. You just see the outline of the bowl, the outline of the goldfish, but somehow you get the sense, you read that as volume, as they're swimming around there just freely as the models are staring at them. Also in 1929, he made these extraordinary prints, which are really, I think, a lot of fun to work with. These are just so spontaneous and so kind of wild. There was no position. Imagine how hard these models have to work. And there are many stories about Matisse working his models very hard, forgetting that they needed to eat or go to the bathroom, making them work all day long, really. He had to have his studio assistants remind him that they needed a break. And all of this movement, the poses that were taken in these modeling sessions are very athletic and very full of movement. Yet, again, it's amazing how everything is really drawn in such a flat way. The table seems to be tipping forward. It's hard to separate visually all these aspects of ornamentation against even the figure drawn in these very curvilinear, volumetric way is kind of held back by how he's laid the shading in, much like those earlier prints we saw. This is a picture of Matisse in his studio, and it's a favorite picture of mine because I'm always, I'm very interested with Matisse. I really want to see the evidence about what these prints meant to him and how he was really, why did he do them? Why was he doing so many of them? And this is a wonderful indication as he's working in an early version of that seated nude. He started in its very small scale, and then this one just disappeared and it got very much bigger. But some of the prints that we've just looked at are pinned to the wall up here, along with some reproductions of a courbet up in the background. This is a reproduction of a great Cézanne bathers. This is a reproduction of a painting. You can see this is a drawing by Michelangelo that he had. So all these references surrounded him, and he looked at each of them. It was all a matter of trial and exploration as he explored these motifs. This is a print, again, for those of you that have been to the Barnes collection, you'll recognize this as the dance mural. It's not actually the one in Philadelphia. It's actually the first version that turned out to be mismeasured. This is one of the few color prints that Matisse made, and he probably made it to try to help him sell the first edition. So as you knew, he worked very hard on the Dance 1, thinking that it would fit perfectly into Mr. Barnes' house. And as he got there, he realized that it was mismeasured and didn't fit. So he had to go back to France, and he started on Dance 2, leaving this aside. When he finished Dance 2 and it fit in the Barnes, he then went back to do version 1 and finished it. They're really pretty different as compositions. But he couldn't get anyone interested in it, so he made this print collaborating with an expert in doing color printmaking to kind of, since the first version was in Pennsylvania, no one in France really knew much about this great mural composition, so this print was a way in which he could introduce it to the French public. It relates again to our other great nude in Baltimore, which is the pink nude, which is one of the first paintings that came after the Barnes mural, and you can see how closely it relates. Again, pay attention to what we saw way back in that Bonheur de Vivre. She looks like she could have come right out of that painting, but has been slightly updated. Again, the way that she's drawn with this attention to outlining the shape and the contour of the figure, and the color is kind of just brushed in a sort of even field. You can see the sense of brushing, but there's very little shading in a way to model the volume of the figure. But we don't, and to make it worse, she's been glued on this bedspread of blue here and a tile wall in the back, a flattened out chair with a flower on it. But the way that we can read this is because even in the course of this lecture, I hope, and as you wander through the show, you're able to understand what Matisse's graphic language is and how he can transform what we would understand as three-dimensional in the studio and achieve so much more. In 1938, he began another technique, which was called linoleum cut. Now remember, I said that those early woodcuts were originally thought to be linoleum cuts because of their wonderful linearity. But in fact, they were woodcuts. But these actually look the way they do because Matisse was able to take a sort of digging tool and slide it through the linoleum in such a free way that he was able to draw freely. These linoleum cuts have the same kind of idea behind them as those early monotypes, where instead of having the white of the paper and the darkness of the lines, he's reversed it. So the light is seeming to gleam, to sort of come out from the background, come out to us through these slits, and everything else is dark. So you get darkness surrounding and light kind of screaming out. Some of these prints were actually done in color, in this sort of golden color, which helps that effect even more. This is another one, A Head of a Woman from 1938. Just a wonderful image, how he understood the possibilities of this medium, which he also used in a number of illustrated books that he made at this time. In 1948, so 10 years later, we see what he's doing in lithography. In some ways, it's not that far off from what we saw early on. Again, you know, working on the face as a contour with gestures, but then just sort of scribbling in the hair as a way of making the face kind of jump out. And then the final technique that Matisse took up, again, one very much motivated by drawing, was what's called lift ground aquatint. Now, there are some explanations of these techniques in a little brochure that goes with the show. I don't want to take too much time to explain them. But essentially, at this time in Matisse's career, he became very enamored with drawing with a brush, with a heavy, wide brush, say, you know, maybe an inch wide. And he made drawings, just dipping it in black ink and doing these drawings very much like this. Well, he wanted to find an equivalent in printmaking that was like these heavily drawn wash drawings. So again, working with experts, not one to be an experimenter. He wasn't like Picasso, like to stick his hands in the acid and do all manner of experimentation. Matisse worked with a printmaker that helped him develop this technique. of lift ground aqua tint. So what you would do is he would brush, just like it was a piece of paper, he would brush the image on a plate, and this lift ground would actually be made of a kind of sugary substance. You then would roll the ground that would protect the plate. You'd roll it on top of that, those lines that Matisse had painted on the plate. You put the plate in warm water, and that ground that he drew with, the sugar lift, or the lift, began to lift the ground off the plate. So the plate was protected everywhere but where Matisse had drawn those heavy lines. Then he would put aqua tint inside to hold the ink. They're printed, it's amazing how they were printed because those lines are so dark. This is another example of one of the rare color prints that he did, and you'll see this in the exhibition, starting again with black as a lift ground aqua tint, and then again probably working with a professional printmaker, beginning to add these fields of color, which eventually end up in this final edition. This is a painting from about the same time, which is in our collection, and you can again see the similarities about the way that Matisse would work in these prints and paintings. Here again you see these fields of color that seem rather flat, and it looks as if he's actually drawn the tree sometimes over the color and then sometimes filling up a white area that he'd left in the color. So you get these things that seem very flat, and yet they're able to suggest the space in the background. The figures as well, it looks like he laid in the color first, and then he went back and drew almost like a drawing, kind of filled in these features and the dark to actually describe the features of the figures. This is an installation from this exhibition when it was in Baltimore. You can see I added a few prints in this case. But this is the way that Matisse actually lived with these prints and similar drawings. So all over his studio, he would put them in different sorts of order, just filling the walls. And they're wonderful pictures of him sitting in a chair, just looking up at the walls. This is an excellent way of how he liked to look at things in series. This is one model, for instance, here, Patricia. And he did these different views of her and loved to look at her all together. This is another model, Nadia, and he would group them together so he could see the kind of themes and variations between them. He might also lay in or in some earlier ones of his prints from the 29. These are from the 40s. Here's again Nadia. You see, I mean, a strict profile, but yet you get just enough lines, and you can almost count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's all. Yet he's able to suggest the volume of the face, the character of her features, and not without even finishing the head. You get with this run down here of her hair, you get the sense of how the fullness of her face. Again, the way he composes these scenes within this rectangle, pushing it over to this side so it almost looks like it's been cut off by the paper. This is the same model, Nadia, seeing her in an entirely different way. No, this is the hair, but you feel like here you're looking at her skull. Again, one line that goes all the way up there, maybe to here. Looks like there might be another one there, one that comes down. Look at how, that one line can suggest the bridge of her nose and also, the transition to the mouth. Or this line here, all the way up there, that suggests even an aspect of shading, as if there might be more, that we're looking at her as a profile, in spite of the fact that these heavy lines against this white paper would otherwise look very flat. A mask, again, more symmetrical, but look at how he gives the sense of movement of the face turning to the side just by taking this one line, which changes the face, the nose, from being straight on to being seen in profile. And the sense that you follow that line and experience it, very quickly running along like this. Now, Matisse was sometimes accused of being very facile. That he had this technique down so well that he could just draw things without any effort. But Matisse worked so incredibly hard. He drew over and over and over again. And he trained his arm so he could look at something and just do it like that in the end. But it's not a matter of facility. It's a matter of absolutely integrating what he saw with what he did with his arm. It's as if his arm had a visual sense, his eyes had a physical one. Faces like that often appear within his paper cutouts. And I wanted to bring that in, although it doesn't really have anything much to do with printmaking. You can see how these faces, just like what we saw there, are often placed within. This is a decorative composition for what eventually became a tiled mural. This cutout is from the National Gallery's collection. And then finally, we get these two images of Matisse, self-portraits from 44 and 51. I think that maybe even in terms of what I said, I portray Matisse as an extremely serious artist, and he was. He worked very hard. He was very much a narcissist. He expected his family to work very hard to support him. He was totally absorbed with his work, and he really saw that. I mean, that his work was everything for him. But it's nice to see that when he turns to a self-portrait, and you'll see several self-portraits within the exhibition, I see a glint of humor and self-understanding that maybe you don't see as often when you work very hard to support him. He was totally absorbed with his work, and he really saw that. I mean, that his work is unique. It's really an interesting way to understand the evolution of Matisse's graphic language. And because printmaking, as I said, could be shared with so many, it is so important to see in concert with paintings and sculpture so that we understand the fullness of this artist. Thank you. Oops. I went a little bit long for you to ask questions, but I hope maybe you still can. Does anyone want to, anything that occurred to you want to ask me about? Yes?
I think anybody who lives through the World War is affected by it. Matisse lived through two of them.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the effect that may have had on people?
Yeah. Matisse has sometimes been criticized. He once made this regrettable comment about that he saw art as an armchair, and that it was a way to kind of, for us to relax and sort of forget the world, or at least that's the way that quote was interpreted. And people, some critics took that quote and said, you know, how horrendous, I mean, how he should have been an artist like Picasso, who, you know, dealt with the Spanish Civil War and dealt with some of the political things going on around him. How, when you look at Matisse, as you say, you don't see anything of that, and he did live through 2 wars. But what Matisse really meant by that quote was that he meant that art should be something that was surrounding, that one should be so involved in it and engaged by it, and also engaged with a power of observation or seeing the world in an artistic way. What Matisse said was that really it was the only thing that he knew how to do, was to be an artist. And he's a remarkable artist because you see this kind of trajectory that starts from the beginning and goes all the way through his life, often imperiled by very poor health. He had abdominal surgery, cancer, and which prevented him from being able to stand up and paint. That's why he went to the cutout. But it's so amazing that he evolved those beautiful cutout shapes when he couldn't do anything else because he was physically disabled. So he would say, you know, the best thing that I could do in the course of war was to keep creating art. It wasn't for him to take on political commentary. It wasn't that he wasn't engaged with it. Both his daughter and his wife were involved in the French resistance. He knew, they didn't tell him totally what was going on, but he knew that they were threatened, and he was very involved. We have a lot of correspondence between Matisse and the Cohn sisters, our great collectors, and he talks about his family and his worries about the war, but it never comes out in his art. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
An amendment to your excellent talk.
Thank you.
You said you've only been here for a day, so you've probably never been to the Moss Museum.
No.
It's devoted to Tiffany, and as you know, Matisse and the other fathers got involved in the decorative arts.
Mm-hmm.
And when they had glasswork, they sent them to the Tiffany Works, the Tiffany Studio,
Right.
which was the outstanding studio in the world,
Mm-hmm.
created for them, and then send it back.
Right. Matisse was also very engaged, as you can probably surmise from looking at the decoration in the background. He grew up with a family of textile artists, textile workers. He collected textiles. He dressed his models up in them. He pinned them up all around his apartment. There was a wonderful exhibition at the Metropolitan 2 or 3 years ago called Matisse and Textiles. And I think it's interesting to think about how those decorative patterns, that sensibility for decoration, is so crucial to how his art works. So, yeah, I'm not going to be able to visit that museum this time around, but I'll do it next time. I'd love to come back, especially in the winter. Any other questions? Yes?
How did Baltimore come to accumulate so many of the prints?
Well, through these two remarkable ladies, Etta and Clarabelle Cohn. It's a long story with them, but Etta, so they were both born in the 1860s, 1870s. The older sister, Clarabelle, died in 1929. The younger sister, Etta, died in 1949. It's kind of a Baltimore story, too, but the Johns Hopkins Medical School was the first medical school to accept women on an equal basis. So there were medical schools that would let women in, but as special students. Because of one really great donor who told those men on the board of Johns Hopkins that if they wanted a very big gift from her, they were going to have to let women in on an equal basis. So at first they said no. Eventually they said yes. Now what does that have to do with anything? Well, what happened is that a number of remarkable people came to Baltimore, remarkable women, including Gertrude Stein. She came to Baltimore to attend Johns Hopkins to study psychiatry. Though she didn't finish, she developed a close relationship with Clarabelle Cohn, who was a doctor and was actually working at Hopkins. So when Gertrude Stein gave up studying medicine, she and her brother Leo went off to Paris, and the Cohns followed them. And so pretty soon, the Steins had introduced Etta and Clarabelle first to Matisse and then to Picasso. So in 1906, they started collecting those two artists and kept collecting them all the way through their lives. So between collecting sculpture, prints, paintings, illustrated books, the Cohns collected about 800 works by Matisse, also drawings. And they gave, in 1950, when Etta died in 1949, she gave all of her sister's collection and her collection to the museum. There's also a textile tale here, because the Cohns made their fortune from being textile manufacturers. They were the largest manufacturers of denim in the world, so they made all that denim for Levi Strauss. And they had a fair amount of money, especially in the 1920s, to spend on art, and those two sisters did, and then they left it to Baltimore because they felt it would be transformational for what was a fairly provincial city.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank you.